And we're back with Dean Slaughter, Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School of International Affairs at Princeton University. I want to take a step back and talk about something that you just mentioned, liberal internationalism, which is sort of a theme that you talk about or mention in your book, The Idea That Is America. And correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understand it, it's basically this concept that the U.S. or any country sort of does best if it's working in concert with the rest of the international community, whether that be political or militarily or economically, that sort of shared values of democracy and humility and sort of Western values promote the well-being of all countries. How does that translate into sort of hard U.S. national security, foreign policy issues that we're hearing about as we head into the November campaign?
Well, so part of it, the idea of liberal internationalism is an idea that rejects pure power politics. It says, absolutely, we know power's out there, we're not crazy, and we know that in the international system you have to take power into account. That's why I gave the example of Franklin Roosevelt setting up the UN and recognizing that if you didn't get the great powers on board, just signing your name to a piece of paper wouldn't do anything. Right. Liberal internationalism says, yeah, there's power, but it's not the jungle. You know, it is possible to get nations to cooperate, and over centuries we've made a lot of progress. So in the 19th century, it was perfectly legal for one country to invade another. Nothing happened. You know, you just went to war. You declared war. And in the 20th century, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, or even when Russia's invading Georgia, there are consequences. And even if you don't send troops in to drive them out, it is illegal. There's a lot of consequences. So liberal internationalism sees the steady, slow building of both order and peace and values like, no, you can't commit genocide. No, you can't commit crimes against humanity. No, you can't just wipe out another people or your own people with impunity. Right. And what I've argued is that the United States, at its best, has served the values that are universal values. They're not just our values, they're universal values of liberty and justice and equality. I also include humility and tolerance and faith, and that it's possible for us to be plenty realistic and understand power, but still, when we can, advance those values. And that when we do that, it doesn't just make us a better nation, it makes us a safer nation. That those two things actually go together.
That's a very interesting concept. I hope people have an opportunity to read about it and learn about it, because I think there's a lot of value in understanding how that works.
Thanks.
I want to take another, not to bounce around, I want to take one step back and talk about the international framework again and delve a bit more into the nature of the changes of the nature of how the international framework has changed, or international legal bodies have changed. So my understanding is that sort of the international law is based on this concept that states are the preeminent actors, and treaties are signed by states, and our foreign policy to a large extent is determined by state actions. But now we've reached sort of a point in whatever you want to call it, globalization, where we have a lot of non-state actors, whether that be multinational organizations like the EU, trading blocs, or subnational actors, right. Particularly in the sort of terrorist context like Al-Qaeda. How does the international legal framework adapt to that? Is that something that we're going to see in the next 15 years, 20 years, 5 years? I mean, what needs to change, whether that be the UN Security Council, to sort of respond to the changes that are going on a day-to-day basis?
So I think one way to think about it is to see these two worlds existing simultaneously. So the old world of international relations is what we call the billiard ball model, where states are like billiard balls and they crash into each other, and there are rules that govern when and how they can relate to one another. But what happens within those states, nobody knows. It's a billiard ball. It's opaque and hard. And individuals within those states, they don't even count. They just don't exist in the world of international relations. So that's the old model. Now that model is still there, as we've just talked about. You have Georgia and Russia and the United States and the EU, which is a group of states. That world is still there, and there are new states coming up. The biggest difference in that world is that we have to find a way to make the United Nations Security Council and the G8 and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund include India and China and Brazil and South Africa and Mexico and other countries that are coming up. They have to have their place at the table, because we're dealing with a 21st century world with a set of 1945 institutions, when Britain and France and Germany and China and the U.S. were the only powers in the world. So there's that world, and that's the task. You have to broaden the circles of decision. And then at the same time, there's what I think of as the MySpace world, or the our space world, where it's nothing but networks, right? And it's networks of corporations, of criminals like terrorists, of non-governmental organizations. Think about the worldwide environmental movement or the human rights movement. There are all these networked organizations, even government officials. So if we have a health crisis, the people who are going to fix it are not going to be the World Health Organization. They're going to be the people at the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta and the people at the state level. So there are these networks everywhere. And those two worlds, that MySpace world and that billiard ball world, are all kind of tangled up together. And what we have to do is to, on the one hand, recognize they're still states. They still have a lot of power. They can still invade other states, and we'd better include new states in that order. And at the same time, we need to have those big state institutions interacting with the Gates Foundation and the Amnesty International and large corporations, and we got to be able to figure out how to use networks of people to track down networks of criminals.
Well, before we run out of time, I do want to ask you one question.
Sure.
We do have a presidential election coming up, and regardless of where our audience falls, the new president is going to face a lot of challenges in the next year. What advice would you give? What priorities would you list for the new president when he's thinking about foreign policy?
Well, so if he said to me, what are the issues I should focus on first, I would tell him, it will be him, that much we know, you've got to focus on non-proliferation. I mean, if more countries go nuclear with a lot of terrorist groups running around, sooner or later someone is going to use a nuclear weapon in a terrorist attack, and that will change the world as we know it. So you have to focus immediately on non-proliferation. Climate change and energy. If we don't figure out how to stop emissions and change the sources of energy we use, we are going to find ourselves not only in maybe an unlivable planet, but we're going to have huge security problems. If Bangladesh goes underwater, 1 billion people will be on the move, and they've got to go somewhere, and that's going to create a lot of conflict. So climate change, non-proliferation, certainly Iraq, Afghanistan, and terrorism, but also relations with the Muslim world. That's a third basket. So those are the three areas substantively I'd say he has to focus on. But what I would tell him, the first thing he ought to do in his first foreign policy speech is to address the peoples of the world and say what I just said, which is to say the United States is the most powerful country in the world, but we recognize, based on the values we are committed to, that it is not okay to have a world of 6 billion people in which, about 1.5 billion of those people, maybe 2 billion, make the decisions for everybody else. And we need a system where those other powers, where India and China and South Africa and Brazil and Mexico and others have a voice. And I think that is where the United States ought to be. It ought to be standing on the side of democracy, and democracy in the world, it doesn't rub out power. Tonga doesn't get the same vote as China, but it says you have to have a voice. It's your planet too.
Well, Dean Slaughter, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Shedding your insight and giving us some of your time. Hope we can have you back soon.
Absolutely.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.